What about now? Can everyone hear me? Alright, good. Looks like people can hear me now. Sorry, my internet was kind of causing problems, so I had to do some quick repairs on that. I was a little bit concerned for a bit that I wouldn't even have internet, and that was going to be very disconcerting considering this class that I prepared for. If everyone would like to just dive on in. Last time we discussed the beginning of the sages, as we know them today, though they claim descent from the time on Mount Sinai and receiving the Torah. How we understand the structure today really began with Ezra coming back from Babylon. They had the Great Assembly, then they have Shimon the Just, followed by Antigonus. Now we're going to enter a period called the Pairs, or the Zugot. The period of the Pairs begins the 2nd century BCE, which is before Common Era. The area of Israel had been hotly contested between two Hellenic groups, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The Seleucids ultimately controlled Israel and surrounding territories when the dust was down. Everyone had decided where the battle lines were drawn. Though previously Shimon the Just had been high priest and Nasi, that is, leader of the Sanhedrin, he also sought a balance between Hellenism and Judaism. This was no longer the case under the ruler Antiochus Epiphanes. The priesthood was now bought rather than earned, and according to the books of Maccabees, the priests would forsake the temple service to participate in the gymnasium. So, even though it's a little bit late, we're dealing with the story of Hanukkah here. Some Jews even went so far as to stretch out their foreskins to hide their circumcision. So the Greeks, seeing any of that, although they would do a lot of their sports naked, is considered to be improper. So to be circumcised is actually to be kind of disgusting in their eyes. According to the text of the Hebrew Sibyl, there may have even been Jewish women who joined in Hellenic religious practices, similar to the Oracle of Delphi. Though even there, that text has kind of a distinct Jewish flair, focusing a little bit on like the moral aspects that the prophets of yore may have called upon. This is just a good example of how far Hellenic culture reached into the Jewish world. So this is the world the first pair, both named Yosef, find themselves in. Yosef ben Yoezer of Sereda and Yosef ben Yohanan of Yerushalayim. And let me find here their little quotes in Pirkei Avot so we can get a good idea of who they are a little bit. So, Yosef, son of Yoezer, would say, "Make thy house a meeting place for the sages, sit in the dust at their feet, and thirstily imbibe their words." And Yosef, son of Yohanan of Yerushalayim, was wont to say, "Let your house be open wide so the poor may be of your household. Engage not in overmuch converse with a woman." And there's a little additional part they add in, which may have been added by the Moraim to explain this a bit. If he said this of his own wife, how much more does this apply to the wife of another? Furthermore, the sages added, when one engages in excessive converse with a woman, he is neglecting the study of the Torah, harming himself, and treading the path which leads to eternal destruction. These are the statements of these sages, these pairs. They both had been students of Antigonus. Because remember, Antigonus' focus was dealing on the fact that there were no real miracles anymore And according to some reckonings, this is the beginning of the era of the Tanaim, though others suggest this actually begins with Antigonus himself. Tana is an Aramaic honorific for teacher, and even as late as the era of the Amoraim, some are called Tana to describe how great their learning is. So the real question is, why are there two leaders instead of one? So technically the text itself implies that they are both students of Shimon the Just and Antigonus, because it says it received the tradition from them. So even though traditionally Antigonus and Shimon are not put together in the concept of a pair for the reckoning of the sages. So perhaps there had been some overlap in their ruling as Nasi, or Antigonus had served under Shimon and was promoted to the position of Nasi at some point. In any case, the way the structure of the Sanhedrin worked, Yosef ben Yoezer was the Nasi, the leader, and Yosef ben Yohanan was the Av Beit Din. You can kind of consider the positions like president and vice president, in that the Nasi was the actual leader, but the Av Beit Din could step in during his absence. Later, this position would be combined into one, which makes me personally think that the positions were weak, that they didn't have a lot of power individually, and the Sanhedrin was seeking to establish itself legally over the Jewish residents of what was technically a Greek state. For example, later on, even today I'll be discussing this Nasi of Yeshua ben Parachia. He attempted to rule the wheat of Alexandria was impure, but the rest of the sages overruled him. So we can see that they weren't seen necessarily as the final authority. Further, the times were quite dangerous and full of turmoil, so it would have been dangerous to put the reins of the leadership fully into the hands of a single individual. So that person was to be killed or captured, then the Sanhedrin wouldn't have a leader, or their leader would be trapped and unable to help with rulings. Later on, when things became a lot more secure, the dual leadership would eventually actually be abolished. So I think this further supports my opinion on it. Before I go further into the political climate that they are living in, I'd like to address their statements in Pirkei Avot. Both ended up focusing on the economic reality that few really had time for study and many were poor. Although a few hundred years had passed since the end of the Babylonian captivity, most Jews still remained in Babylon. This created a depleted workforce, particularly as Antiochus became stricter and crueler. Many were trying to flee the land. So in Tractate Shabbat, it shows that the prayer ruled ruled uncleanness in regards to the lands of heathens and of glassware. So this seems a little strange of a ruling, but the scholar Louis Ginsburg suggests that the uncleanness was to prevent emigration, so that the Jews who are experiencing hard times in the land of Israel wouldn't leave and further depopulate the region. And the uncleanness was given of glassware, because in those times the Canaanites had a monopoly on glassware in the cities of Sidon and Tyre, and it was devaluing Jewish metals and pottery, because the Jews would end up buying from these locals so that they wouldn't have to worry about impurity. By ruling that glass was also incapable of gaining impurity, this meant that now everyone had an equal standing in the marketplace. Oddly enough, despite these rulings, Yosef ben Yoezer is called Yosef the Lenient, though this appears to have been a mocking title from the Proto-Sadducees in response to his lenient rulings on temple purity laws. If we remember, the Sadducees, they don't fully exist as a separate group yet, though a Midrash connected them to being the descendants of students of Antigonus and a misunderstanding of his teachings. In reality, the name reflects a particular priestly family, who, as we go further along, will actually become more and more important to the story. As for Yosef ben Yohanan's rather sexist remarks, let's just be honest, this is unfortunately the reality of their times. Though we've had a history of strong female leaders, we've had prophets, we've had warriors, It's always been a complicated history. Patriarchally generally reigns supreme, even in our culture, and it especially reigns supreme in Hellenic Israel. According to Hellenic thought, the human male is the pinnacle of creation, and the woman is somewhere below that. Usually they place her above animals, but in reality they saw all of creation kind of ordered, and that the human man was going to be at the top of that. So women are generally not given the same educational opportunities, and as such, speaking with them was considered to be a waste of time since you could spend that studying Torah instead. It was an unfortunate situation of that time. Some areas still actually kind of focus on this. When I lived in Crown Heights, I actually, that was the Chabad Central. A lot of people focus on trying to put tefillin on men. And even though they'll hand out Shabbat candles to women, generally they leave that for the Chabad women to do to them. I pointed out that if they focus a little bit more on the women practicing, the men are just going to follow. So really they should be doing more about Jewish education for women, but most people didn't really listen to me, I guess. Yeah, thank goodness they're equal now, right? That's what it's saying in the chat there. So that's their opinions on the lifestyles that they're dealing with. Now we're going to enter into the actual Hasmonean uprising. Like I said before, the priesthood was now being bought. The family of Sadok, where the word Sadducees comes from, traditionally kept the position of high priest since the Second Temple's building after returning from Babylon. Jason of Sadok had bought the position from the Greeks, but someone named Menelaus paid more. He was from the priestly family of Bilga, and they were kind of like the Hellenizing family. This was the first time that Bilga had come into this position, and their household even intermarried with the Seleucids on a regular basis. Menelaus fell into debt and ended up selling the temple articles to pay Antiochus back, which that's already was upsetting people who may have otherwise been kind of in the middle. Before, most people were willing to kind of live under Hellenic rule. Alexander the Great had been particularly kind to the Jews, but these are starting to be the last straws. He, after getting these articles to be paid back, he started releasing stricter and stricter laws, attempting to assimilate the entire population to Greek values. This wasn't just happening to Jews, this was happening to everyone in the Seleucid kingdoms, but it affected us in particular. Due to our monotheistic belief, it was a little hard to syncretize this with the Greek polytheism. He erected images of Zeus throughout the area, and in fact, particularly Hellenic Jews started calling him Baal Shemayim, Master of Heaven. And then the classic story where they start going to the villages as well, because there's holdouts of proper Jewish belief outside of the cities, because these people are kind of living out there just practicing their lives. You run into Modi'in, the priest Matthias. He stabs the Greek officer rather than sacrificing a pig to Zeus, and so starts the brutal war that was the Hasmonean uprising. Let's see, where are we at here? Eventually we have Antiochus V calling an end to the war following the loss of the temple precincts to the Maccabeans. This is where we get the story of Hanukkah and the dedication of the temple. The word Hanukkah itself has to do more with dedication, that the temple is being repurified, the sacrifices being offered again. And in fact, some of the earliest references to the holiday of Hanukkah, it's called Sukkot in Kislev, which means that they were not able to practice during the war the holiday of Sukkot, so it was pushed off till Kislev when they rededicated the temple. Menelaus is slaughtered as a show of faith by the Greeks together with their permission to have limited Jewish autonomy under the Maccabean rule. So essentially Jewish affairs can now be run by Jews and Greek affairs can be run by Greeks, even though it's still a Greek state. They reached a compromise. However, in 160 BCE, Demetrius succeeded him and resumed hostilities. Now we have this priest named Alchemist. He buys the high priesthood, and he's actually the nephew of Yosei ben Yoezer, the Nasi of the Sanhedrin. He and Bacchides, representative Demetrius, seek to execute 50 Hasid priests. Now, the exact definition of the Hasidim we discussed through a series of Midrashim at a later time, as there are no proper descriptions available during this period in chronology. But we do have some descriptions of particular Hasidim who lived at a couple generations from now. For now, it's important to note that in the books of Maccabees, the Hasidim are very anti-Seleucid rule and strongly assisted in the Hasmonean revolt. And this puts Yosei ben Yoezer in danger because he's called a Hasid among priests by the sages. We're not really sure what happened to the other Yosei. Perhaps he died during the uprisings, perhaps he's been captured, perhaps he was executed. But we do have the story of Yosei ben Yoezer's passing. So his nephew comes with officers. He takes Yosei away. You would find this, by the way, in the Bereshit Rabbah. So he's riding. The nephew, Alchemius, is riding on a horse. It's on Shabbat, when this would be forbidden. Yosei ben Yoezer is carrying a beam that he's going to be crucified on. And Alchemius taunts Rabbi Yosei. He says, "Look at the horse on which my master has let me ride, and the horse upon which your master has let you ride." He, as in Rabbi Yosei, replied to him, "If this is the end of those who anger him, how much more those accomplish his will?" Then Alchemist jeers back, "Has any man accomplished his will more than you?" To which Yosei finally responded, "If this is the end of those who do his will, how much more with those who anger him?" It says, "These words pierced him like the poison of a snake, and he went and subjugated himself to the 4 modes of execution inflicted by the Beit Din: stoning, burning, decapitation, and strangulation." What did Alchemist do? He took a post and planted it in the earth, raised a wall of stones around it, and tied a cord to it. He made a fire in front of it and fixed a sword in the middle of the post. He hanged himself on the post, the cord was burnt through, and he was strangled. The sword caught him, while the wall of stones fell upon him, and he was burnt. Yosei ben Yoezer fell into a daze as he saw this fire, and he said, "By a few minutes he has preceded me into the Garden of Eden." So, here we see that families were divided. It was a complicated time. I mean, the Greeks were in power. You want to help them out. But on the other hand, they're not really allowing Jewish practice. The story told is obviously a midrash. It's not meant to be taken literally, but it does show that people may have collaborated with the Greeks and then felt remorse later at handing family members over. They would kill themselves. It's a particularly terrible time in our history. After these horrifying events, Judah Maccabee dies in battle. His brother Jonathan takes up the banner, leads the revolt. Surprisingly, Demetrius ends up capitulating and returning to the same semi-autonomous rule he had previously just turned against. In the year 150 BCE, Jonathan backs someone named Alexander Bolus against Demetrius, which turned to be in his favor because Alexander wins. In return, Alexander Bolus appoints Jonathan high priest and governor of Judea. Ironically, this promotion prompted a lot of Jews to see him as a puppet of the Seleucids, the very claim the Hasmoneans had made to overthrow the previous Seleucid rulers. Following his death, a third of the Maccabean brothers, Simeon, takes the mantle. At this time, Antiochus VII is in rule, and he complains that the Jews, more than ever, were coming to the land. And Simeon gave him an interesting reply in the book of 1 Maccabees. He responded to Antiochus, "We have neither taken any man's land, nor do we hold dominion over other people's territory, but only over the inheritance of our fathers. For a certain time is held unjustly by our enemies." So you can see this being as a time similar to the modern founding of the State of Israel after its survival during independence. It revitalized the Jewish spirit, and people wanted to settle in Israel, which hadn't even happened when the Persians ended the Babylonian captivity. So Simeon takes this opportunity to convene a national assembly that the people might ratify his position. He doesn't want to just be in his position because the Greeks say he is. He wants the Jews to confirm it. He asks to be formally recognized, or he asks the Hasmonean dynasty be formally recognized as the people's leader, which is effectively a king, as the high priest, and as generals. So when the people accepted this, it consolidated all the power into that one family, the Hasmonean priestly clan. Though done in a popular consensus, the forsaken priestly clan of Sadok, the sages, and various royal contenders all had reasons to disapprove of this move. As we progress, you'll see more and more of why the sages disagreed with this. Simeon gets killed during an attempted coup, and his son, Yohanan Hyrcanus, comes into power. With the people's support, he rapidly crushed all the opposition, and much like a Hellenic Yehoshua in the book of Joshua, he conquered and enslaved the people living east of the Jordan. Then he expanded Judean control, so it's not just around the enclaves of Jerusalem anymore. And then he reconquered the Galilee to the Negev. During this time, it's likely that the Samaritan temple was destroyed as a move to concentrate all power in the Jewish temple. As we recall, there was an attempt through a midrash to relate Shimon the Just to Alexander, and that got destroyed during this time, but this is more likely, parable aside. Arguably, this is the most of Israel Jews are controlled since the monarchies of David or Shlomo. He also reconquered the territory of Edom, which during the monarchical period had been a tributary to Judean kings. Unlike other groups that he conquered at this point, he forced the Edomites to convert. Now, though historically many of the Edomites had willingly joined the Jewish covenant, this was seen as a grievous sin by the sages. Like, Jews don't force people to convert. And it would actually have dire consequences for the dynasty in the future. It's going to be an interesting turnaround as we go by. Sarah Gushin says, so this would be ratified by the people. I assume you're referring to when Simeon combined the powers. Yes, he made a national assembly, so you have a lot of foreign Jews coming from Babylon, probably from Alexandria, coming to live in Israel, and he got them all together in the temple precincts, and he had them confirm his position, and that the Hasmoneans now would be the dynasty covering all three branches of Jewish leadership. Yohanan gets praised by the sages for instilling Jewish identity back into the populace. There's a little fun quote about that. So In the Mishnah Ma'aser Sheni, it says Yohanan the high priest abolished a declaration concerning the tithe. He also put an end to the arousers and the knockers. And until his days, the hammer used to smite Yerushalayim. And during his time, there's no need to inquire concerning demei produce. So first of all, the arousers, the Levites in the temple used to say this one line of "Arise, why do you sleep, O Lord?" This was not seen as proper. It implied that we kind of told God what to do, and when God chose not to support us during periods of hostility, that it was our job to awaken him like he wasn't looking at us. This was kind of seen as heretical. God was paying attention according to the sages and Yohanan's view, just he chose not to until the Maccabean revolt. Demei is produce which there's a doubt as to whether it had been tithed. So he's saying like there was never a doubt about the tithing of produce in his time, which means there's an increase in Jewish practice. Tithing takes a lot from you if you're an agriculturalist, and it also means that the economy was doing better. The other statement about until his days the hammer used to smite Yerushalayim, apparently in Sota, in the Talmud, it says that this is referring to the days of Hol HaMoed, the days, for example, in Sukkot or Pesach, the middle days. They have a slightly lesser holiness and restrictions, and one isn't supposed to do unnecessary work on those days. Obviously, when the Jews were going through rough times, everyone worked every day that they could, and now they're saying that things are becoming better under Yochanan's rule, and that people no longer have to work on Hol HaMoed. However, despite how well they, or how much they appreciated his work to instill Jewish world back, like there wasn't really enclaves outside of Babylon or Alexandria, and especially not in Israel until the Maccabeans. They still decried his power grabs. After all, the priests were supposed to serve God and not to rule. In Jewish tradition, those had always been separated. And in fact, it was forbidden to anoint a priest as a king. These two are not to be combined. So although initially favoring the sages, their consistent distaste for his political side opened the door for the Sadok family, or the Sadducees. In the tractate of Berachot, it mentions, for Yohanan the high priest officiated as a high priest for 80 years. In the end, he became a Sadducee. So, what does this mean? Though the high priesthood now belonged to the Hasmoneans and not the Sadducees, the two fundamentally agreed as they supported the consolidation of power in the temple establishment, while the sages dealt more with the equalizing of all of Israel. So this period of sectarianism likely led to the persecutions against the sages, and it forged further schisms with the invention of the Essenes. It's during this time that the appellation of King Yanai is invented for Midrashim, and this gets applied to all hostile Jewish leaders, which makes it a little hard sometimes when reading through the Talmud, because then you have to kind of figure out which King Yanai they're talking about. And this is going to be the backdrop for our next pair, Yehoshua ben Parahia and Nitai Ha'arbeli. Let's read their famous quotes in Pirkei Avot. If I can find it. So, Yehoshua ben Parahia used to say, "Get yourself for your studies both a teacher and a fellow student. Judge all men charitably." Nitai Ha'arbeli said, "Keep away from evil neighbor. Have no satiation with an evil man. Doubt not eventual retribution." Now, there's very little written of their personal legal discussions, though Yeshua ben Parachia is the one I quoted earlier about the wheat from Alexandria. There's almost no information to enlighten us on Nitai, though I see his final statement about not doubting retribution as showing the further sectarianism starting to grow, as the Sadducees did not believe in an afterlife, and with Antigonus and his dealing with the fact that there were people being rewarded for evil in this world, he wanted people to be certain to understand that at some point there would be a retribution. He specifically didn't precisely say when. Now, Yeshua ben Parachia's statements have some interesting midrashim to clear up his reasoning for why he said that. So in Sanhedrin, it says, when King Yanai slew our rabbis, Rabbi Yeshua ben Parachia, and a lot of people translate it, and Jesus, fled to Alexandria in Egypt. When peace was restored, Shimon ben Shetach sent this message to him, from me, Yerushalayim, the holy city, to you, Alexandria in Egypt. My sister, my husband is dwelling in your midst, and I am desolate. Rabbi Yeshua rose and came back. He lodged in an inn where they paid him great respect. He said, how beautiful is this Achsania, which people debate if that means an inn or the inn hostess. Jesus said to him, my master, her eyes are narrow, which makes more sense for a person at that point. Wretch, he rebuked him, are those the thoughts that occupy you? He sent forth 400 horns and excommunicated him. Later, the disciple came to him, repeatedly pleading, receive me, but he paid no heed. One day, while Rabbi Yeshua was reciting the Shema, Jesus, came back before him. He intended to receive him and motioned to him with his hand, but probably something like this. But the disciple thought he was rebuffing him. So he went and set up a brick and worshipped it. Rabbi Yeshua said to him, repent, but he answered him, I have received this tradition from you, that he who sins and causes others sin is denied the opportunity to repent. So, let the left. In Sanhedrin, we see a further illustration. It says, let the left hand reject, but the right hand draw near. So you should never fully push someone away from you, like what Yeshua did here. And they say, not like Elisha, who thrust Gehazi away with both hands, and not like Rabbi Yeshua ben Parachia, who rejected Jesus with both hands. So just like they blamed Antigonus for the eventual downfall with the Sadokim and the Bothusians, they also blamed him for the downfall with Jesus. It's not likely that this actually was Jesus, though a lot of people try to claim it was. Obviously, there was some sort of disciple that became a heretic, but most evidence shows that the historical Jesus, both himself and most of his earlier followers would not have been considered actual heretics according to Jewish law. And they definitely would have been worshipping a brick. Especially as Jesus wouldn't have been active or alive, really, to study under Yeshua, unless Yeshua lived a really long time. What's likely to have occurred is it was anachronistically applied to this story, most likely due to the similarity in the names and the Egyptian connection with the New Testament story of Jesus and his family being in Egypt. So later when the heresy with the Christians was rising and there's tension between the two, they kind of took this story about a older heretic with the same name and applied it. It's not, again, it's not likely as applying to Jesus of Nazareth, though a lot of people try to use this story that way. Let's see, so we're at 437. Okay, so we see here that the sages were strongly disapproving of the consolidation of power into the Hasmonean family, even though they initially were supporters of the Hasmoneans, which explains why there's barely any reference to the holiday of Hanukkah in the Talmud itself. Though it's referred to and it's mentioned that the lights were lit, and we do have evidence that it was pretty regularly celebrated by the Hasmonean family and thus supporters of the Hasmonean family, the sages wished to diminish the idea that the Hasmonean clan had done something right with what they did. They may have been correct to overthrow a government which was oppressive, but they were not right to in turn become an oppressive government themselves. And in the book of Maccabees, there's zero reference to the miracle with the oil. It's likely this was also a creation to counteract the idea that through the Hasmoneans' own prowess, they earned their position, and it was more of a push to show that it was only through God's support, through miracles. So again, we're having kind of this argument between whether or not it's more natural events or if there's always some sort of divine force dealing with it. In fact, the holiday of Hanukkah was so diminished in its practice that the Jews of Kaifeng, China, who are originally of Persian extraction, didn't even know the holiday when they met other Jews. They still practiced other post-biblical holidays like Purim, but Hanukkah they didn't really know about. They didn't even really know the story of overthrowing the Seleucids. Likely it was only actively really kept in the land of Israel anyway, until the much later Roman expulsions would spread it out again amongst the other Jewish populations. Its popularity today is more due to its proximity to other winter holidays. Let's see. So, do we have any questions? Let's read what the chat has to say. What is today's ruling on working on Hol Moed? Yes. So in Hol Moed, you're supposed to avoid doing unnecessary work, according to Jewish law. However, since you're already taking the days off for the actual holidays, if you do need to work on Hol Moed, it is usually understood. But generally, you're supposed to try to still give this an elevated status over a normal weekday. Sarah Gushin says she describes Hol Moed as it's not one of the major holidays, or as Hanukkah is not one of the major holidays. Yeah. She says no one wants to believe her. Yeah. I think part of it, everyone wants, a lot of people will ask and think that Christmas is essentially the Christian version of Hanukkah, when in reality Christmas has a much greater theological repercussion to Christians than Hanukkah does to Jews. Let's see. I see in the chat it says not allowed to ride a horse. Who knew? Yeah, on Shabbat, you're not supposed to make your animals work either. So riding a horse, both you have the issue of traveling beyond the amount you're allowed to travel on Shabbat, as well as you're not supposed to cause animals to labor directly for you. In the Torah, it specifically talks about that your servants, your slaves, your animals, your whole household is supposed to not work on Shabbat. So it was when Alchemist, who at that time was high priest, is riding on a horse to execute his own uncle, the Nasi, the Sanhedrin, who is also a priest, though not the high priest. It just shows how intense the Hellenic push was. Pull the hamster wheel out. Well, if your hamster really wants to exercise, maybe your hamster is not Jewish. Anyone in the chat have any other questions about the topic at hand? We had some interesting characters that occurred here. A lot of interesting interplay. The whole Hasmonean attempted coup and everything. It was like Game of Thrones, Jewish style. Like, does anybody have any questions I can address? They say Hanukkah Harry gives socks and pants, and that Hanukkah is a holiday of giving school gifts. It's not far from the mark, huh? You can't believe they gave all that power to one family, is the comment in the chat. It's kind of, they also suggest they're desperate. It's kind of the condition throughout history. When people have just suffered under an oppressive regime, they'll jump at the first available figure, that first available leaderhead. And it's only later that people usually regret this. I mean, at the time, no one was expecting the Maccabees who had helped fight alongside them. They didn't expect this to become a corrupted system. Even the sages themselves didn't expect the high priest Yohanan to switch to the side of the Sadducees. As that statement said, he was for 80 years high priest, and then at the end he became a Sadducee. Out of the fire into the pan, yeah. That's what the chat says. Anyone else? If you type into the chat, it'll prompt you to log in. If you haven't, you can make an account really quickly. Oh, this is David. Hey, David. Let's see if there's other things I can talk about with that. What do you guys think about the Hellenic culture still kind of defining the Jews in those times? Even though they had pushed off Seleucid rule, it really was a Hellenic state. What are people's opinions on this? How do you think this affected Judaism today? An odd little side note, I remember reading about the Jews actually living in Greece. They actually very specifically focused on the holiday of Hanukkah not being as fighting against the Greeks, but as fighting against the particularly oppressive regime of the Seleucids, not Greeks as a whole. Often when you hear this story be told, people refer to it as the fight between Jews and Greeks, but obviously Jews living in Greece itself, this wouldn't be a very appropriate thing to say, nor did they probably feel that way. They probably felt like Greeks who happened to practice Judaism, and not necessarily as Jews separate from Greeks. David says, just talked about this, but I can't remember. The artwork. Yes, we do find a lot of archaeological sites that have very, very Greek arts. I mean, there's the famous synagogue that has the zodiac in it, though I can't remember if that's actually a Greek or Roman period synagogue off the top of my head. Sarah Gushin says, we still have some of the Hellenic ideals today. Very true. Which ones can you guys think of that come immediately to mind? Sarah Gushin says, education, physical beauty. Very true. In fact, that was part of the issue the Jews were having. That's why, remember, it talks about making your home a place for the sages and to learn from them. There was Hellenic education available, and a lot of Jews were forsaking the Jewish education that they should also be getting. Not necessarily that it's forbidden to study Hellenic philosophy, and in fact, if you study any of the works coming out of Alexandria from the Jews, they very, very much studied the Greek philosophy and sciences together with being practicing Jews. What about in practices? Well, some people say that the way that we decipher the Torah now, got it actually right here, or the way that they would derive things from the Torah, some say that was actually based off of Greek thought. Yeah, when Rabbi Ishmael says the 13 methods on how to expound logical deductions from the Torah, some people have argued that is actually based off of a Greek learning method. Sarah Gushin says the gymnasium versus the temple. The gymnasium did in fact cause a lot of problems for the Jews. They, though being physically fit is promoted, Jews are supposed to remain healthy. The gymnasium had certain problems. It wasn't really considered modest. There are sports that they did that under Jewish thought were violent and unnecessary. For example, the book of Maccabees refers to the priests who would leave the temple and run off the gymnasium, and specifically brings up them practicing the forbidden practice of boxing. Now remember, we might think boxing today, they've got gloves, they've got rules. It wasn't until much later that you couldn't gouge someone's eyes out or things like this. And this was seen as a very, very dangerous and not fitting sport from Jewish perspective. Anybody else have questions? Who would have said wrestling? Wrestling, they probably had issues with wrestling, but the book of Maccabees specifically mentions boxing. David mentions the senseless destruction of another life. Correct. In fact, I was just doing some research on the change that the sages made eventually from eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, how it became a monetary effect. The very statement that they made was that it only says you can take an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But if someone were to take an eye and that person would then lose their life, you are not permitted to take their life in response to an eye, which is why it's monetary compensation. Tying that into the senseless destruction of another life comment. A lot of quiet people today. Expecting a lot more interaction. David says, so no eye for an eye. Bummer. Yeah, well, we can't always get what we want, you know? Baby Leonia says, such intricate teaching, it's hard to formulate response sometimes. Oh, my teaching or the Talmud? Talmud is pretty intense. Saragushin says, and let's not forget the Greeks did glorify homosexuality. Omnimodus says they didn't glorify it so much as hate women. Now we've got a few things. We've got bring up pederasty is more than sexuality. Interestingly enough, pederasty wasn't meant to openly be available. There's a lot of push against pederasty in Greek and Roman societies. And people usually would try to cover it up by saying this was their apprentice or things like this. So, yeah, the pederasty thing wasn't actually quite as common in Greek society as people sometimes think. David mentions, I do not like the view of women at all as BS, we're equal. Very true. Like I said, unfortunately, when you're looking back at things in history, a lot of times they don't have the same hindsight that we get to have. Hanalea mentions women's are not equal in the ancient world. Their value lay in childbearing and homemaking. Correct. Though, I will specifically bring up later, next class will actually have a prominent woman in it, and further along there's going to be another one. And I'm going to talk about the changes in the sages and how some of the sages much later on were more conservative than the Tanaim themselves about women. David said, well, I cannot have a child and I don't bake worth a damn, but I can fix a car that is equal. Hanalea says the Tanaim were very misogynic. Like I said, it does depend though, Hanalea. Further along, I'm going to be mentioning how The Tanaim were actually, in some ways, a little bit more liberal about women than the Amoraim tended to be, which is very interesting considering that they were the ones surrounded by Hellenic culture more than the Amoraim surrounded Roman culture, though the Romans had become a lot more conservative about women later on. It's a very good chat. As David reminds people in the chat, remember to donate. It's non-profit, so it runs on your donations. And if you enjoyed this program, as well as all the others that we have on here, we'd really appreciate any donations. Every little bit helps, and always make sure to come and watch other videos and interact. We always love to hear what you have to say. In fact, I make sure to keep like a little bit at the end of my classes just for the interaction. Not saying anything. Everyone went really quiet all of a sudden. Hollis says, often the perspective we see happening in the ancient world is often because of other culture interaction. Very true. The cultures would shift based on who they interacted with. Thank you, everyone. Remember, next week I'm going to try to have the next couple pairs, and we're going to go all the way up to Hillel and Shammai, the founders of the two famous schools of Hillel and Shammai. And we're also going to see a very prominent Jewish woman in the role of leadership, as I was mentioning earlier. It's going to be very interesting considering the time. Toda Rabbah, everyone. Have yourselves a good rest of the week and stick around. I think there's Hannah, you're doing a Torah study after this, so stick around for that. And I'll be sitting around in the chat if I can get to work. Later, everyone.